buddies, and welcome back to my channel. I am Gwen and I thank you guys for joining me today. So today's video is a writing tip number 2, settings and creating characters. Okay, but before we get started, I'll do a quick recap of the previous video. So in writing tip number 1, we decided, or Gwen decided, that the best way to start your story is to decide on your conflict and your climax, which is the resolution of your conflict. And the reason you want to do that is because everything you write from chapter 1 or your prologue, if you have one, has to lead you up to that climax. And you don't want to spend a lot of time writing something and then decide, oh, this is where I want to take this story, but nothing I've written will get me there. That's very frustrating and time consuming. So to avoid that, decide where you're going before you start your journey. One thing I did not point out in that video I'd like to point out now is to please make sure your conflict is actually deep enough to carry an entire book. What I mean by that is I have read books, not many like this, but I've read a couple to where the main conflict can be resolved if someone just has a conversation. And I've seen that in romance novels to where, the woman, refuses to talk, and no, I'm not being, prejudiced against my own gender or anything, but usually in the ones that I've read, the woman, gets her feelings hurt, and sometimes a guy makes an assumption, whoever it is, they, overhear part of a conversation, or they hear some gossip or whatever you want to call it, and then they refuse to just, say something to the other character that, is the other half of this. So that's very frustrating. Like, of course, those little things can happen, but you need to resolve them quickly. When your entire, main conflict can be resolved by someone listening to someone, just giving them a chance to explain. It's very frustrating, to go 15 chapters deep with she refused to answer the phone, or he refused to unlock the door, and they, refused to talk, whatever. That's very frustrating, and I have to tell you, that is not a conflict. Like I said, that is just somebody being difficult. So if you've already written your conflict and you know that's not what's going on, great. If you think you have some of that going on, take another look at it and, add a little bit more drama to it. Okay, with that being said, let's move on to tip number 2. So let's start with settings, okay? Your book can be set wherever you want it to be. Pick a city. If you're in the U.S., pick a state, pick a country, choose a continent, and if for you sci-fi writers, go to a whole new planet. That's great. Here is a word of advice when you're doing that though. Research, research, research. That is the word. Research your location. Okay, I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. So if I'm reading a book set somewhere in this Metroplex and someone says, Ray, or whoever your character is, jumped in his car and headed north on Interstate 51 out of Dallas heading into Oklahoma, I'm just going to cringe and make a face like this, and I'm going to be like, oh no, there is no, Interstate Highway 51 leaving out of Dallas going into Oklahoma, and that would be so distracting to me. You may say, Gwen, it's fiction, it doesn't matter, but you know what, it does. Certain things matter. Even though this is fiction, you have to stay within the realm of believability. And so for people who are familiar with the area in which you've set your book, they're going to notice these things. So please make sure you do your research, okay? That doesn't mean everything. Like business names, like the name of a bookstore, of a restaurant, a flower shop, a shopping mall, or anything like that. Name it whatever you want to. You don't need to research that because businesses come and go, right? So there may have been a store called Margot's 10 years ago and now it's not, but nobody's going to rewrite your book every time a business goes away or something. So that's not important to a reader. But something static like a highway, for instance, you be very, very careful about that. And not only does the highway exist in that city, but make sure you take it in the correct direction, like Highway 35 in Dallas or Fort Worth, because each city has one. They run north and south. So it would be very distracting to a reader familiar with the area to hear you say someone headed west on I-35. You see what I mean? So be mindful of that. Another thing to be mindful of is the climate. Okay, that's very important because, once again, the realm of believability. So if you want your characters to have a white Christmas, I suggest you don't set that book in Australia. See what I mean? So I think it's like 100 degrees there on Christmas or something, but they go to the beach. So if you say they had a white Christmas in Sydney, Australia, somebody's head may, well, they're going to do this, make that face. So avoid that. Research, research, research. I can't say that enough. So choose your setting and then do some research on it. Also, think about the events that are going to unfold in your your story. Is there any particular place you have to discount, or certain areas you must use? For instance, if the waves are going to wash up a bottle from 100 years ago, well, I'm thinking that needs to be near the ocean, right? So that book does not need to be set in Kansas because there is no ocean in Kansas. See where I'm going with that? So be mindful of all the events. Now, that doesn't mean your book can't be set in Kansas and then somebody went on vacation near the ocean. That's absolutely, go for it. People travel in books all the time. But I'm just telling you, don't move the ocean to Kansas. That whole believability thing, you can't do that. We don't have 800 feet or 3,000 foot mountains anywhere in Texas. So don't move the ocean, don't move the mountain. I know you wanna, but don't do that, okay? So that's why it is very important that you research. Now, I know you know where the oceans are. I don't mean something like that, but still be mindful of the areas that you select and, the climate and all that kind of thing. Now, one way to knock down a little bit on your research is to create your own city. So that's fine. You don't have to use an actual place that exists. Name your city, name your country, a whole new planet. One thing I suggest you don't do is create a new state. America has 50 states, okay? Don't give us a 51st because that, once again, is going against that whole believability thing. So do not create a new state, but create a new city within a state. Once again, you still have to be mindful of certain things like the climate, because if you create your new city in New York, then you have to be mindful of the New York climate, just like California, Florida, Texas, wherever. So it doesn't take much, but I will tell you this: your readers will care as much about your book as you do. So if they see a lot of things like this is not possible, that's going to be a big turnoff, and you don't want your readers being distracted because you chose not to do a little bit of research. Okay. For you sci-fi writers out there, go for a whole new planet if that's what you choose to do. I suggest you create a planet instead of using another one. Like if you set your book in Pluto, you're going to do that whole thing about readers going, people can't live on Pluto. And it could be a big turnoff. So my advice is to just create a whole new planet and the sky's the limit. Do your thing. So let's recap about our settings. Research. That's the biggest recap, is to make sure if you're going to use anything static like a highway, or if you're going to talk about what the climate is like during a certain time of year, just make sure you do your research on that and make sure that setting fits whatever is happening in your story. Here's one thing about settings. When you create your city or country or whatever, a lot of people struggle with the name. They say, I don't know what to name, my location, and they struggle with that. So I know that can be very hard. I will give you this advice, and I think it's really cute, and I see it in a lot of series that I read. For instance, Susan Mallory, she has a series that's set in Fool's Gold, California. Do you see how that name came about? So the gold rush and gold fever and all of that in California. So her city is called Fool's Gold, California. I'm not reading it right now. I have read a couple books in a series where it is set in Painted Barrel, Wyoming. So I've never Googled Painted Barrel. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say it's not a real city. If I'm wrong, please forgive me. But I still think it's catchy because they're all ranchers. So a barrel, it's Painted Barrel, Wyoming. So I thought that was really cool. On another note about that, the occupation, I just thought of this when I said they're ranchers. Okay, people can have whatever job they want to have, but I would be mindful of like having a big ranch in Manhattan. See where I'm going with that? Like be very careful of stuff like that when you're selecting your setting. So hopefully that's some good tips for you as far as selecting a setting, and then the name. Like pick a name for your city based on what your city will remind them of, like the Fool's Gold and the Painted Barrel. So you can come up with some really great names, and sometimes you just make a post and someone will be happy to help you with that. But with this tutorial or tips or whatever you want to call it, I suggest you make that name something that means something to you. So let's move on to creating characters. Okay, just like your setting affects, your plot affects your setting, it does too with the characters as well. Now you don't have to limit your characters. There's a lot of stereotyping when it comes to characters. Like the librarian, she always has a bun and glasses glasses and a pencil skirt, or the professor, he wears a sweater vest and thick frame glasses and he doesn't have a cool haircut. Or, you know, we have a tendency to think based on somebody's occupation or age or whatever that they have to look a certain way. That is not the case. One thing I like to tell, and I did this in a written post on my blog, and I'm going to use some of that information here, is sprinkle some gold dust on your characters and your story and give your readers some magical. Basically, okay, take your professor, your math professor. He doesn't have to be what some people would consider dorky. He can be 6'3", red-headed, full beard, wearing jeans all the time with t-shirts that have rock bands from the 60s on there or something. Okay, your librarian could actually be more like a biker chick. She could have tattoos and not even ride a bike. But she doesn't have to be dull or, you know, have her hair in a bun. Not that people who wear their hair in a bun is dull, but you get what I'm saying. We get this image of them. That's not a requirement. You don't have to stay in this little box, okay? Come on out and do something different with your characters. And that's not just in the realm of, you know, their physical appearance, also with, you know, occupation, personality, their lifestyle. For instance, single parents don't have to always be struggling. They don't have to always be living paycheck to paycheck. You know, you can have a very wealthy or, you know, very well off financially well off single parent. They don't have to be struggling. And the single parent, it doesn't have to be because the spouse died or left him. It could be, you know, maybe this woman, she was ready to be a mom and hadn't found Mr. Right, so she got in vitro, you know, or artificial insemination is what I'm trying to say, I'm sorry. Maybe she got that. And then for the guy, he was ready to be a dad, but he hasn't found Mrs. Right, so he adopted. Those things happen. So try to use something like that, but you don't have to stick to the stereotype is all I'm saying. If you choose to do so, that's great. Nobody's knocking you. I'm not saying your story won't be great, but I'm just giving you ideas to kind of broaden your horizons, like give readers something new. And you can do that simply by, you know, your character having a unique look based on their age or occupation or, you know, something different that other than what people would expect. When it comes to naming your characters, I have 2 words of advice for you. First of all, this is mainly for people writing historical fiction. Okay, in the 1700s, 1800s, I'm not telling you there was no Tiffany. There probably was a Tiffany. But I'm saying be very mindful of choosing names that's kind of out of your era. Now today, somebody may be named Margaret after their grandma, or somebody just liked the name Margaret. So I'm not telling you to limit the name to a certain thing. I'm just telling you that to be mindful of that, especially in historical novels, that they had more traditional names back then. Another thing about naming is when you're naming your characters in your book, do not have, or I advise that you don't, you're free to do whatever you want, have too many characters whose names start with the same letter. So if you have Colin, Cooper, Connor, and Cadence, somebody may get confused. One way to combat that, like especially if these are siblings and you're like, but I really want them to have those names, give them nicknames. You know what I mean? And then use those nicknames throughout your book. But your readers can get very confused when everybody's name sounds so similar. So be mindful of that when you're naming your characters. And there is one more thing I would like to say. We move all the time. People immigrate to different areas all the time. So if your story is set in Mexico, and please, I'm not trying to be racist in any way. That's not me, but I'm just saying this is more of a stereotype thing. Everybody in Mexico's name is not Maria or Juan or Jose. Okay, people have other names. They're named after, you know, first of all, those aren't the only names in Mexico. So every Hispanic person, she doesn't have to be identified as Hispanic because her first name is Maria. Okay, his name doesn't have to be Juan and Jose. Name them something else. Sometimes people move from other countries into Mexico. And people who watch Househunters International know that, right? People move and go to different countries all the time. So you don't have to even be stereotypical with their name. Their name doesn't have to fit the region where they live. You can do whatever you want with that. And that sometimes is a little gold dust for your readers. Just a simple name change, you know? So be mindful of that as well when it comes to creating your characters. Now let's talk about their personalities. Your character's personalities will determine how they behave. So think about what it is your character needs to do in this book, and then their personality needs to fit that. We will talk about character growth and development later, but I will say, at some point your character will grow, but you want to avoid making it unbelievable because it's too easy. We will talk about easy fixes when we talk about plot development, but for instance, if your character is later on in the book going to have to lift some 300-pound boulder, you need to mention his muscles early on, not all of a sudden go, oh, and by the way, he has a lot of muscles. See what I'm saying? So make sure that you think about the events of your book, even if you don't have them all worked out. That's fine, because you can always go back and tweak things later. But if you have some of these things in mind, then make sure your character fits, their role. You want to make sure that. And back to their personality, not everybody is the way they are because of a reason. Some people are the way they are just because that's how they are. A guy can be grumpy, and a girl too, a woman too. I'm not just saying guys are the only ones grumpy, but a character can be grumpy just because that's just how they are. Not because their dad was, not around, or mom was mean and uncaring, or the older sibling picked on them all the time. No, some people come from a really loving family, but they're just not very happy people. And I don't mean to be negative here, but sometimes people have a certain personality trait. They're very, very serious, or they're very untrusting just because that's how they are, and not because anything happened to them. If your story is about internal growth and getting over a past pain, then that's fine. Then you say, he doesn't trust women, or she doesn't trust men because they got their heart broken before. That's very, that's usual in a romance, but you don't have to use that, and there doesn't have to be a reason. So keep that in mind. Don't bang your head thinking, why is he like this? Why is he like this? Some people are just the way they are because that's just how they are. And that's okay. That's not given a reason. It's actually the equivalent of sprinkling a little gold dust on there, because for some reason most writers feel like they have to have a reason why that character is the way they are. And I'm here to tell you don't. So, quick recap on characters, okay? Be unique with not only their look, but their personality. Give them a quirk of some kind. Just give them something new. Think outside the box. Make sure that if their occupation requires a certain physical trait, that you give them that physical trait early on, so it doesn't look like an easy fix later. Make sure, for instance, their physical appearance matches their climate. Like I said, someone who's from a very hot region and lives there full time should not be described as pale. So just all of these things like that. I guess it wasn't a recap, but it was just some quick little pointers there. Make sure you think about all those things when you're creating this story, because when you send it off to be reviewed, or people just choose to review it, someone who reads a lot or who's just very analytical will pick up on those little nuances, and it could affect, their review of your book. So just be mindful of all of that. Once again, even though you are writing fiction, it still needs to stay within the realm of believability. So that is it for week 2 tips. Thank you guys for joining me. If you have any questions, please do drop them in the comments down below. I'd be happy to answer each and every last one of them. I also have a forum on my blog, which there's a link for that in the description down below. If you want to post some questions there, I'll be sure to answer those as well. With that being said, that ends today's video. Week 2 tip. I will be back next week with week 3 tip, which is plot development and character development. We created the characters today. Next week we'll develop them along with the plot. But in the meantime, feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you may have. Once again, thank you guys for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, happy writing.